A coalition of concerned Nigerians, G100, says it has concluded the first phase of talks with leaders of 6 opposition parties in a bid to build a united front ahead of the 2027 general elections. So in the statement issued yesterday and signed by Salihu Lukman, the G100 said those consulted included former Vice President Atiku Abubakar, Peter Obi, Rabiu Kwankwaso, and Oyo State Governor Seyi Makinde of Allied People's Movement. The coalition also said it engaged leadership of the People's Democratic Party, the People's Redemption Party, and the Social Democratic Party. He described the discussion with the national chairman, presidential candidates, and running mates as frank, constructive, and encouraging.
Hello guys, welcome back to the Pivot Report. For months, Nigerians' opposition have been talking about one big idea, unity. But now, that conversation appears to be entering a more serious phase. The G100 says it has completed its first round of consultations with opposition parties and political leaders ahead of 2027 election. And an opposition unity summit is expected to take place in Abuja on the 18th of August. But there is something particularly interesting about this latest development, because the opposition landscape has already changed. Peter Obi and Rabiu Kwankwaso are no longer simply two separate opposition figures being discussed in isolation. They are already being presented as a ticket, with Obi as the presidential candidate and Kwankwaso as his running mate under the NDC. So, the question facing the G100 is no longer simply, can Obi and Kwankwaso work together? They already are. The much bigger question is, can that existing alliance be brought together with Atiku Abubakar and other opposition forces to create one broader political front for 2027? And that is where the story gets really interesting, because Nigeria has tried opposition unity before. Sometimes it has worked, sometimes it has fallen apart, and the difference has usually come down to one thing: political compromise. So, can Nigerian opposition finally make that comeback or compromise work? Let's look at it. According to the latest reports, the G100 has completed the first phase of consultations with opposition parties and political stakeholders. The discussion have reportedly involved several opposition parties, including the ADC, the PDP, NDC, SDP, PRP, and APM. The group is now looking towards an opposition unity summit scheduled for August 18 in Abuja. The objective is straightforward: to explore how Nigerians' opposition can work together ahead of 2027 election. And that may sound familiar, because Nigeria has seen several attempts at opposition cooperation before. But what makes this particular moment interesting is the political configuration that is already emerging. There is already an Obi Kwankwaso ticket. There is Atiku Abubakar and the political network around him. There are opposition parties with their own structures, and there are governors and other political actors whose interest will also have to be accommodated. So the G100 isn't starting with a completely blank page. It is trying to bring together political pieces that already exist. And that is much harder than simply creating a new coalition from scratch. This is perhaps the most important correction to the way this story should be understood. Peter Obi and Rabiu Kwankwaso should not simply be presented as two politicians waiting to decide whether they will cooperate. They have already taken a major step towards cooperation. Under the emerging NDC arrangement, Obi is being positioned as the presidential candidate, while Kwankwaso is the running mate. This is politically significant because the two men bring different political constituencies and political histories to the same ticket. Obi has built a strong national movement since the 2023 election, particularly among younger Nigerians and in parts of the South. Kwankwaso brings substantial political weight from Kano and the wider Northwest. So, in theory, bringing those two political bases together creates an interesting electoral calculation. But there is an even bigger question. Can this ticket become part of something larger? Because if the G100 succeeds, the goal would presumably be bigger than one party or one existing ticket. It will be about creating a broader opposition front, and that brings us to Atiku Abubakar. Atiku is one of the most experienced presidential politicians in Nigeria. He has contested the presidency multiple times. He has a national political network, and he remains an important figure in the opposition conversation. So imagine the political equation. On one side, you have an existing Rabiu Kwankwaso ticket. On another, you have Atiku and the political forces around him. Then you have other parties, governors, former officials, and political movement looking for a role in the 2027 context. The G100 is essentially attempting to ask, can all these interests find enough common ground to work together? And that is a very different question from simply asking whether the opposition wants President Tinubu defeated, because most opposition politicians can agree on the need for a strong challenge. The difficult part is deciding what happens after everyone agrees to cooperate. And this is where history becomes important. Nigeria has already experienced one of the most significant opposition measures in its political history. Before the 2015 election, several opposition forces came together to form the All Progressive Congress. The merger brought together political interests that had previously operated separately, and eventually the APC succeeded in defeating an incumbent president. That experience provides an important lesson for 2027. Opposition unity is possible, but it requires compromise. Politicians who once wanted to lead their own parties had to accept a common structure. Different political interests had to negotiate, and eventually one candidate had to emerge. That is the part of the 2015 story that matters most today, because forming a coalition is relatively easy when everyone believes they will benefit equally. The real test comes when someone has to give up something. And that is exactly where the 2027 opposition project could face its biggest challenge. Now, look at the 2023 election. Nigeria had several major presidential contenders. Atiku Abubakar contested under the PDP. Peter Obi contested under the Labour Party. Rabiu Kwankwaso contested under the NNPP. And Bola Tinubu contested under the APC. The opposition was therefore divided across multiple major political platforms. Each movement has its own supporters. Each had its own strategy, and each believed it could build a path to victory. But the result demonstrated one of the enduring realities of Nigerian presidential politics. Fragmentation matters. Whether a united opposition would definitely have produced a different result is impossible to know. But what is clear is that opposition votes were distributed across different political platforms. And that is precisely what today's unity discussions are trying to address. The question now is, what happens if those political forces don't compete separately in 2027? What happens if they coordinate? What happens if they combine their structures? What happens if they present a single, broader alternative? That is the political possibility behind the G100 talks. there is still one enormous obstacle: leadership. If Obi and Kwankwaso already have an existing ticket, and Atiku remains a major opposition figure, how does the broader coalition work? Does everyone simply rally around the existing ticket? Does another rearrangement emerge? Does the coalition negotiate a completely different formula? Or does the opposition eventually decide that individual ambitions must take a backseat to a larger objective? These are not easy questions, and they cannot be solved through slogans about unity. They require negotiations, they require trusts, and perhaps most importantly, they require politicians to believe that the agreement will actually be respected. Because there's a big difference between saying we need to defeat the APC and saying I'm willing to support someone else to lead the ticket. That is where political alliances becomes real. This is why the August 18th summit deserves attention. It should not be viewed as though an opposition coalition has already been completed. It hasn't. The summit is better understood as another step in the negotiation process. The G100 is trying to create a space where these different political interests can discuss what cooperation could actually look like. And that is important because the opposition has something it did not have in the same form before: an emerging structure around which discussion can take place. But whether that structure can hold together remains the big question. And naturally, there is another side to this story: the ruling APC. For President Bola Tinubu and the APC, a divided opposition presents one kind of political challenge. A genuinely coordinated opposition presents another. The more opposition parties compete separately, the easier it is for each political movement to focus on its own base. But if those parties began sharing structures, combining political networks, and presenting a common presidential alternative, the political calculation becomes different. That doesn't automatically mean the APC will lose. Far from it. The APC has its own political structure, incumbency advantage, and alliances across the country. But a united opposition would create a much more straightforward choice for voters: the incumbent versus a consolidated alternative. And that is exactly what makes this negotiation worth watching. But perhaps the most important question is not whether the G100 can organize a meeting. It is whether the politician can make the kind of compromises that successful coalitions require. Can the Obi Kwankwaso ticket fit into a larger opposition arrangement? Can Atiku and his supporters accept a structure that does not necessarily place him at the top? Can the various parties put aside some of their individual interests? And can they do it early enough to build a functioning national campaign before Nigerians go to the polls? Because a coalition announced at a press conference is one thing. A coalition with functioning structures across Nigeria is something completely different. Nigeria's political history has shown us that opposition unity can change the direction of an election. But history has also shown us that political alliances can collapse when personal ambition becomes stronger than the common objective. That is why the G100 talks are worth watching. Not because opposition victory is guaranteed, not because a final coalition has already been formed, but because the political conversation is beginning to move beyond who can defeat Tinubu and towards the much harder question: what are the opposition politicians willing to sacrifice to make unity possible? The Obi Kwankwaso ticket has already demonstrated that political compromise is possible. The bigger test now is whether that compromise can expand. Because if the opposition can turn separate political movement into one credible national alternative, 2027 could become a very different political context. But if individual ambition once again pull the opposition in different directions, history may repeat itself. And perhaps that is the real story to watch. Can Nigerian opposition finally unite? This is the Pivot Report, where today's headlines meet history. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Till then, bye.